Axios with this, saying gas prices won't return to pre-war levels anytime soon. And also, there are new signs that the Iran war is boosting clean energy, especially as the conflict has exposed countries' vulnerabilities to the disruption of oil and gas. Ben Gieman is here. He covers energy for Axios. And Ben, even if a peace deal is reached in the Middle East, you write that in the long run, gas prices will likely remain a lot higher. Why is that?
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for having me on. I mean, this disruption in the oil market has been really historic. We've never seen anything like this. So let's say that under some hypothetical scenario, the Strait of Hormuz was open for business for transit immediately. Even then, it would take quite a long time to sort of start to restore things to anything approaching the kind of pre-war normal. So there's a few reasons for that. One is simply, marine tankers don't move all that quickly. And so it's going to take a lot of time for tankers to kind of resume loadings, to sort of reach their destinations. Another reason is that, another thing to keep in mind is that during this crisis, the oil market has been not only tight because of these specific disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, but you've got several major Persian Gulf oil producers who have actually had to reduce their oil production simply because they've been running out of storage. And that's not something you can just sort of flip a switch and turn back on. So that is going to sort of be tightening the market for a while. And then there's also a number of reasons that are related to sort of the kind of logistics and specifics of how wholesale and retail fuel markets work in the United States. I mean, just to take, your viewers may have heard the term gasoline prices tend to go up like a rocket and come down like a feather. There's a few reasons for that, right? And, one is that when prices are going up, retail stations are buying fuel at high prices. And then even when oil prices come back down, it takes time to sort of work through some of that inventory. So, these are all reasons why gasoline prices will certainly start to come down. And that will certainly be visible and felt by consumers as soon as this terrible conflict ends. But they will not quickly snap back to those pre-war levels for all the reasons that we were talking about. I've been speaking with different analysts about this, and nobody has a sort of precise crystal ball, I would say. But, what they essentially say is it could be into 2027 before things get back down to where they were. So it's going to be a kind of slow reduction, a reduction, but a fairly slow one.
So what about the immediate term? If a peace deal is agreed to, and that is an if at this point, what would the immediate relief look like if you could quantify it?
I think we would start to see prices, coming down back closer to $4 a gallon, right? Right now, I think the most recent average, according to AAA, is in the neighborhood of about $4.55, $4.56. I think, within a few weeks, they would sort of start to come down in a fairly visible and a significant way. But that said, there's also going to be other factors that kind of row a little bit in the other direction. I mean, we're all familiar with the term summer driving season. We start to see demand pick up, as people are sort of heading out on their summer travel. Another reason for that is that environmental laws require gasoline stations and fuel producers to switch over to what are called summer blends, which are less polluting. So that's another reason why that would sort of mitigate the reduction in prices. So, again, to kind of tie that all up, I would say the prices will come down significantly fairly quickly, but there will not be a reversion to the normal for a long time. And I think certainly the market does not move as quickly as political timelines do. So I think we can expect to see prices higher than they were right through the midterm elections.
This war has shown that a lot of countries are vulnerable to the disruption of oil and gas. What has that meant for clean energy globally and the case for diversifying?
Yeah, so what I think this crisis underscores is the fact that a lot of nations are very vulnerable to disruption in seaborne energy commodities, oil, natural gas, petroleum products. And so even if you sort of take away the kind of sort of climate or clean energy considerations, there is a strong case for making your country less exposed to these types of disruptions. And oftentimes that's the idea of sort of swapping out, I suppose, imported molecules for, you could say, homegrown electrons. Right. And so that would be, for example, wind and solar in certain cases. On the oil side, that can be electric vehicles, which can sort of use electricity to displace oil. But, it's not going to be the same thing across the board because we're also seeing an uptick in demand for coal in a number of countries as well. That includes South Korea and I believe Japan. So I think, there are at least preliminary signs that this crisis could sort of give some sort of tailwinds, if you will, to what people often refer to as the energy transition. We've already seen a big spike in Chinese exports of solar panels. Some of that has to do with some kind of wonky changes in their own tax treatment, but some of that does seem to have to do with increased demand. In Europe, we are seeing a spike in sales of electric vehicles. So, I think while we're seeing some sort of initial preliminary and anecdotal evidence, I think there is certainly reason to believe that this conflict will have some longer term effect because even once prices start to come back down for these traditional fuels, oil and natural gas, I think governments have gotten a fairly, governments around the world have gotten a fairly difficult and economically harmful wake-up call about some of their vulnerabilities. Look, that said, the energy transition is not cheap, so federal government's budgets are already strained for other reasons, and that could slow the transition down a little bit. So I think what we're seeing is anecdotal evidence that this is going to be helping that transition, and that's certainly something I and a lot of other people are going to watch going forward, whether it provides any type of sort of sustained tailwinds for that.
Yeah, what countries have felt the biggest sting energy-wise amid the war? What countries, for example, could be argued would benefit most from clean energy diversification?
It's a number of countries in Asia because really this energy shock is affecting different places in different ways. And so it's countries that are reliant on both significant amounts of imported oil and significant amounts of imported natural gas. And so, countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, a number of countries in Asia, Europe has seen a spike in natural gas prices as well. It's interesting, in the US, we are much more insulated from this in one way and not in another. We've certainly, as we were just discussing earlier, seen this very steep rise in gasoline prices in the U.S. What we have not seen, however, is a rise in natural gas prices in the U.S. And that is something, that is a vastly important fuel here. It's a vastly important fuel around the world. But the natural gas market, while it is global in a number of respects, it is not as global as the oil market. And so because the U.S. is such a gigantic producer of natural gas, the world's largest, in fact, and a major exporter, but sticking on that production side for a second, we have not domestically felt that impact. So natural gas prices have actually not been going up in the United States. So that is, I don't want to call it a silver lining, but it is a way in which our country doesn't get the sort of double whammy of feeling the impact of higher oil and higher natural gas prices. We're certainly feeling the former, but not the latter.
We're talking about clean energy diversification in some cases, but oil and coal are not going anywhere for now. You write about some reality checks in your piece, and you've alluded to them during our discussion. If you can you expand on some of the reality checks?
Yeah, absolutely. One is that, as we were talking about before, government budgets are somewhat strained for a lot of different reasons during this crisis, and so the cost to some of the capital costs of getting that transition accelerated could be something of a check on that. Another is that coal is an incredibly bountiful, plentiful resource, and so it is often a cheaper alternative as well. So that is something that tends to compete with renewables. And, and also, memories tend to be short, right? I mean, we're in the thick of this war, we're in the thick of this crisis right now, but let's say, as we were kind of batting around before, in a world in which this ends fairly quickly, this will have been a very painful and economically brutal episode, but will it sort of stick in the memory of government policymakers, through the sort of longer timeframes needed to really kind of aggressively hasten the transition in ways that they weren't already? That remains to be seen. And, another one is that there are alternative sources of oil and natural gas as well, right? I mean, certainly the Strait of Hormuz is throttled, but U.S. exports of crude oil, U.S. exports of petroleum products, think diesel, gasoline, and others, they have been at record highs recently. So we are certainly an important supplier to the rest of the world. You're going to see interest, for example, Canada has a major liquefied natural gas project that Shell is the main participant in. That could, the next phases of that project, there's some speculation that this could lead to a final investment decision to go forward with that more quickly. You had Norway the other day making a decision to reopen some natural gas fields that had been closed for quite a long time. So, when countries are looking to diversify, yes, on some level that can mean diversification of the fuels that they're using, but it can also mean diversification of the suppliers of the same traditional fuels, that is to say oil and gas.
You can read Ben's reporting at Axios. Thanks for the time.